go. So what we were learning yesterday is that if a debtor gives over money to a shaliach, to a third party, to be his messenger, to be his proxy, and he tells him, I want you to go ahead and pay this to, or transport this money to my creditor, and then the debtor changes his mind after he already gave the money to the proxy is not allowed to give the money back because he's already acquired it on behalf of the creditor. And the only time he would be allowed to give it back is if the debtor is so upset that he threatens physical violence against him, then he'd be allowed to surrender the money. And what we saw from the second part of that halacha is that you're not obligated to incur physical harm in order to protect someone else's money. And that was an important general halachic principle, that if you feel that by trying to protect someone's assets, you could get yourself in you could sustain serious injury, then you're not obligated to protect someone else's assets. But just to go to this general idea, the first part of the halacha, which is that once the money has been given to the proxy, and then the debtor asks for the money back, the proxy is not permitted to give him back the money. It's not so clear cut. There will be circumstances when the proxy could give him back the money, and that's what we have to discover in the Imrei Yaakov and a little bit in the Biurim as well. Okay, so lechavero aval kusi delav bar shlichusu holech lav kezachi dami. So the first issue is that if it's a non-Jew that you give as the money to as your proxy, that the debtor gives to as his proxy, so then there is no shlichus to a non-Jew, and as a result, you could ask for the money back, and the proxy should give you back the money. Ba'afilu b'Yisrael, tzarich lios gadol u'bardas. And when we're dealing with a Jew, he has to be an adult. So, for example, if I give, of sound mind. So if I give the money to a child, I'm allowed to ask for it back. Ola shona, or any other language that implies transport this money. Kagontain, or if I say give this money to so and so. O yehi manazula ploni, or if this belongs to so and so. So any language that I use that implies that I want this to be given over to my creditor is a language where the proxy understands that he's acquiring it on behalf of the creditor. But if he uses the language, return this to so-and-so, lo havi kaholech v'lo havi kizachi, the Ramah says that that's not a language of acquire it, because I'm asking you to bring it to him, the implication of return it to him, which it's a little bit hard to understand why this language makes a difference. But saying return this to him implies that it's not really his until it gets to his hands. And similarly, if I say pay this to so-and-so, the language of pay implies that the transaction takes place once the money passes hands from the proxy to the creditor. However, others disagree, and others say that even if I say return this to the creditor, that's also a language of acquire it so that it's his, that implies that the proxy acquires it right away. So the first point of ambiguity is who is the proxy? The second point of ambiguity is what precise language was used when the debtor gave the money to the proxy. And the reason why this works, that using the right language causes the proxy to acquire the money on behalf of the creditor, is a principle called zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav, that I can acquire something on your behalf even without your knowledge if it is to your credit, if it is to your benefit. V'nasu hamos shel hamal v'legamri. So therefore, once the proxy has taken possession of the money, it's as if it already belongs to the creditor. However, there's one caveat, and that is that even though the money belongs to the creditor, now, once it's gotten into the hand of the proxy, the debtor still assumes responsibility for mishap along the journey. And the reason is because the creditor doesn't know about it, and he hasn't authorized this method of delivery. And I believe we had seen this previously when we were talking about who's liable for mishaps that happen in the delivery. So for example, if I put something in the mail and it's a payment that I owe to somebody, just because it got lost in the mail doesn't mean I'm off the hook, right? It has to get into the hands of the creditor until, in order for the lova to be off the hook. He says, and furthermore, there's another qualification, caveat, and that is that when I tell a proxy to take this money to my creditor, and we say that the proxy acquires it at that moment, that's only if I put it directly into the proxy's hands. But if it first came into the proxy's hands without his being assigned as the proxy, then afterwards I tell him, now that you have this money, please deliver it to so-and-so. So then he doesn't acquire it at that moment. It has to be that at the moment when I put it in his hands, I give him the instructions to be my proxy. But if I tell it to him over the phone after he already has the money, so then he doesn't acquire it. So that's another exception to the rule. Okay. Next, Yischayev l'shalem lahamalva v'chulei. So what was this? He says, "V'im zirin lo." All right. Oh, so what another thing that we had seen is that since the proxy has already acquired it on behalf of the creditor, if he were to give back the money to the lova, to the debtor, and the debtor somehow fails to ever pay back the debt to the creditor, the proxy is now on the hook. Why is he on the hook? Because he already acquired it on behalf of the creditor. And the fact that he gave it away means that he took the creditor's money and gave it away. So he's on the hook for the money if he ends up surrendering it. Yesh omrim l'davka im he'eni halova ve'en lo mima lifroa as tzarech hashliach shehechzu lifroa lehamalva. But some say that that's only true if the debtor became impoverished and he has no assets to his name. Then, since the creditor can't go after the debtor, he can go after the proxy who acquired the money for him at that time. And therefore, if the debtor still has assets, the creditor can only collect from the debtor, he can't collect from the proxy, according to this first opinion. But there's another opinion that says no, that the creditor now has the advantage that he can wage a claim against either the original debtor or the proxy, whichever one he wants to go after the money, he could. He says, and the reason being is that even though we would assume that it would be preferable for the malva to go after his debtor, because after all, he lent him the money, it's an easier case for him to win. But technically, he's allowed to take the proxy to court also. The reason being is because since the proxy acquired the money on behalf of the malva, once it came into his hands, he was holding the property of the creditor. Okay, and at that point, the lova had no right to take the money back. And it's therefore as if the proxy took the creditor's money and gave it to somebody else. Okay, and therefore, if Shimon, for example, is the creditor, he can go after either the original debtor, or he can go after the proxy. And then there's a third opinion, which says it all depends on under what pretenses the debtor gave the money to the proxy. If he gave it to him as, here, I owe this money because I borrowed this money from Ruvain. I'd like you to take it to Ruvain, please. And then the proxy takes possession of the money. So because it was explained to him that this is a repayment of a debt, the mentality of the proxy is that he acquires the money immediately on behalf of the creditor. But let's say he puts it in his hands and says, this is for safekeeping. The milva lahotza nitna, va'az chayev gam im lo ha'ani halova. He says the reason is that if he told the proxy that, I'm sorry, excuse me, I have to correct myself. The issue at hand here is the proxy was told this money is for Ruvain. Please take this money to Ruvain, it belongs to him. And then the debtor says, give me back the money. Shimon says, please give me back the money. I'll give it to him myself. So it depends. If the proxy gave it to Shimon as a loan, then it's one thing. If he gave it to him just to hold it for a moment, that's another thing. If he gave it to him as a loan, where the implication is, sure, you're the debtor, you're the one who gave me the money, I'll give it back to you. And the understanding is that he's going to be using it perhaps for a little bit longer. So, azhavi posheya. So then the proxy is considered to be a liable party because at that point he had no right to surrender it to the debtor because it already belonged to the creditor. And therefore, the proxy is as much on the hook as the original debtor. But if the original debtor said to him, let me hold this for a moment, I'm not going to use it, and the proxy gives it to him to hold, and then the debtor runs off with it, so then the proxy will be putter in that situation because he thought quite innocently that he was going to get it back a moment later. Okay, yeah. Right. Then why should all these responsibilities immediately fall on him? It's a great question. And the answer is because we have this principle, Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. Because as soon as the proxy took the money, the assumption is he acquired it on behalf of the creditor. It's now the creditor's money. And therefore, I have no right to return it to the original debtor because I'm taking someone else's money and putting it in someone else's hands. That's the reason. That's the reason why he's on the hook. Once I've been assigned with money that doesn't belong to me, and it's supposed to change hands from Shimon to Ruvain, as soon as I take possession of the money, I'm representing Ruvain. I'm representing the creditor, even though I was dispatched by the debtor. So therefore, I have the responsibility now to the creditor to not surrender the money at that point. I can't surrender it. So it's not intuitive. Understandably, it's not intuitive, but that's nonetheless the halacha. Now, here's one more qualification in the biurim over here. He says, "Nira dedavka b'chei gavin lo yachzirem lo, the whole v'halova rotza la'akev hamos la'achar zman k'mo shekasuv kan v'lifro lamal ba'achar kach lachein ein hashliach rashai lahachzirem lo." So Rav Stern makes a diuk. He looks carefully at the language of the text of the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and he says the only time that the proxy should not return the money to the debtor, to Shimon, is only if Shimon tells him, I've decided that I need the money a little bit longer, and I'm going to pay him back in a couple of weeks. So give me back the money. So only in that situation is the proxy not permitted to give the money back to Shimon. Avolim omer lo hachzirim li vani achzirim lamalva be'ez shebedaitcha lahagia l'sham. Kach shehamos lo yisakvu mei lo yoser zmanim ani olichem oata bazeh shori lahachzirim. But let's say Shimon gives a wad of bills to Levi as his proxy. And he says, you happen to be going to New York, right? He says, yeah. Would you do me a favor? Take this wad of cash. I owe my friend in New York some money. And Levi says, sure, no problem. Half an hour later, Shimon goes over to Levi and he says, you know what? My wife told me we have a wedding in New York tonight. I can take the money myself. I don't have to bother you. So do me a favor, give me the money. In that situation, Rav Stern suggests that there's nothing wrong with giving him back the money because you're not creating any additional liability for the creditor. The creditor is getting paid as much on time by getting the money from Shimon as he would be getting the money from Levi. They're both arriving today into New York. And so therefore, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's only if Levi, the proxy, understands from Shimon's request that by giving you back this money, you're delaying payment to the creditor for longer than it would be delayed by my delivering it to him. So that's another big qualification. That's what that's the reason why it's counterintuitive. The halacha says no. Even if the debtor was the one who hired the proxy is not loyal, does not owe loyalty to the debtor, because once he's taken possession of the money, he now becomes, the money is now the property of the creditor.
Not each party that he's okay, I want to do a mitzvah or pick up the money from here, there. Does any other party know it?
Well, someone has to assign him. He can't do it, otherwise he's a ganav. If he just takes the money, he can't do that. So the debtor has to give him permission to take the money. He has to be assigned, otherwise he's just committing an act of theft. Okay, so the if you remember, not too long ago, we did see this halacha that if someone left me a lawnmower for safekeeping, but I know from his previous history that he's given me permission in the past to loan out the lawnmower to another guy, I'm allowed to do so. So you see, therefore, that even though the money may belong or the asset may belong to someone else, but if I know for a fact that the owner will not mind if I transfer it over to some other fellow, so then it's perfectly legitimate. And therefore, certainly in a case like this, where the lender gave it to the borrower and expected the borrower to pay it back, there's nothing wrong with the borrower, the debtor, then saying to the proxy, I'm going to New York anyway. He expects me to pay him back. I'll just take it to him directly. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, I'm not going to go further into the biurim because he goes into a discussion of whether or not this is the implication of the achronim, or the rishonim rather, but the original commentators. But suffice it to say that this is a very important caveat. In other words, it's only if there's additional liability to the creditor by the proxy giving it to the debtor because it's going to take longer for him to get his money, that's when the proxy should not surrender the money back to the debtor. But otherwise, absolutely he should. Okay, so let me just make sure we finished all of the, all right, so tomorrow we're going to look at the commentary on the second part of this halacha, which is to what extent should a person open himself up for physical harm in order to protect someone else's assets? What if there's only a fear that the guy's going to, because he's very intimidating? Like, at what point do I say, okay, here's the money, right? Like, what if a guy comes over to you and says, "Give me your money"? So he said, my son was once held up after working at a store, and he had all of the receipts he had all the cash from the store. He was working at a restaurant. He had all the cash, and he got held up at knife point. So he gave up the money, right? No, it was at gunpoint. I held a gun to him. He gave up the money, or at least he said. What if a guy goes like this? He sticks his hand in his pocket like in the old days, and he says, give me your money. At what point do you have to suspect that your life is in danger? So we'll talk about that, Mirza Hashem, tomorrow. Have a great day.